So I wanted to do a video comparing Canada and Australia, and I thought now's a good time because I came across this Credit Suisse Global International Wealth Report, which basically states that in Canada the average wealth is 400,000 US dollars. In Australia, it's around $550,000, whereas the median wealth is $270,000 in Australia and $150,000 in Canada. So if you see the mean wealth or the average wealth, then the difference between Australia and Canada is only marginal, maybe a 20 to 30% difference, 400,000 versus 550,000. But if you look at the difference in the median wealth, it is 80%, which is almost double. 155,000 versus 270,000 in Australia. That is a big disparity in the median wealth versus the mean wealth, and I think the median wealth is generally a good indicator of economic equality or economic inequality compared to mean wealth, because mean wealth can be skewed by a small number of rich people, whereas median wealth is pointing towards every other person or every other individual. So median wealth is not a perfect indicator of economic equality, but nonetheless it is a better indicator than mean wealth. And if you look at just the median wealth, then it is clear that in Australia the median wealth is significantly higher than in Canada, almost double, right? So I think that is something that also reflects in society. Being in having been in both countries, in cities like Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, Toronto, Vancouver, I can definitely say that Australia does come across as a more equal society. You will see copious amounts of homelessness in parts of Canada. For example, in certain parks in the Toronto region, or in Waterloo, for example, which is in which is near sort of GTA. Also, East Hastings Street in Vancouver. These are places that have large camps of homelessness, and crime rates also tend to be higher and whatnot in these areas. I don't think you come across that in Australia. Australia does have homeless areas, it does have homeless people, but I don't think you will see the extent of homelessness that you do in Canada. You won't see that kind of homelessness in Australia. You won't see them all in one place like that, and not so many of them. And I do think that there are a lot of problems that are associated with homelessness in Canada, which you do not see in Australia for whatever reason. If we talk about jobs and wages, it to me it seems like landing a job in Australia is quicker. For some reason, it seems that Canadian employers take forever to hire people. In Australia, I feel the process is a lot quicker for whatever reason. Wages are definitely higher if you're looking at technical roles. For instance, technical writer is a role. In Canberra, if you look at the jobs for technical writers, they're paying around $1,000 a day. And you look at the same jobs in any Canadian city, and they're paying like 60,000 for the whole year. I've come across similar figures in other fields: engineering, marketing, finance, whatever field you look at, they tend to pay a lot more in Australia than they do in Canada. As a fresher, I think in Australia it is not unheard of for people to be earning 70 or $80,000 straight out of sorry, not as a fresher, but as a graduate. Earning $70,000 is not shocking. Many people earn at least $60,000 to $65,000, whereas in Canada, I think as a graduate, the normal salary ranges would be around $45,000 to $55,000 for most professions. If we talk about minimum wage, then in Canada, in Ontario, the province where Toronto is, the minimum wage is around $15 right now. And in New South Wales, the province where Sydney is in Australia, the minimum wage is around $21. And keep in mind that the Australian and Canadian dollar are practically the same. One Australian dollar is one Canadian dollar as of 2023. So it's obvious that Australia pays better and it pays more as well. If we talk about taxes, I think they're similar in both countries, but they can be slightly higher in Canada. That is despite the lower wages. Unfortunately, that's just how it is. In Canada, do it will vary a bit because in Canada, um, you have a federal tax and then you have a provincial tax, whereas in Australia you just have the federal tax. So there are definitely a few provinces in Canada, like Alberta especially, where the tax you would probably save 10 to 15% in tax dollars if you're on the higher end of the bracket in a place like Alberta. But in most other provinces, Ontario, BC, the popular ones, I think you'll be paying more tax in Canada than you would be in Australia. So that is another round where Australia wins essentially for me. Um, then this I should mention this. There's also something called superannuation, which is very popular in Australia. Everyone has it, regardless of whether you are a worker at a McDonald's or you're working in a corporate firm. You are entitled to something called a superannuation, which is basically 10% of your wage that goes towards your retirement account. In Canada, this is called RRSP, but it is quite exclusive compared to superannuation in Australia, because pretty much everyone in Australia gets superannuation, but not everyone in Canada gets RRSP. Like the workers at Tim Hortons are not receiving a pension plan as such. So I think that's another point where Australia scores and Canada loses out on. So Canada, being part of North America, is also subject to the tipping culture, and you can expect to pay 12 to 20% in tips in Canada, whereas tipping is not a thing in Australia. And so I think that's somewhere Australia scores again, because you just end up paying a lot more in Canada unnecessarily. Of course, Australia is expensive. Like Australia is not cheap either, and there's a lot of problems there. But if we talk just about the service industry, where in North America they're really dependent on the tips, in Australia people earn at least $30 to $40 as part of the service industry. If we talk about say bartending or acting as a service staff during Christmas or Boxing Day or New Year's Eve, then in Australia you will notice that there are people making $100 per hour even, and it's rather standard over there. Whereas in Canada you would be lucky to get $50 an hour in one of those roles during the festive season. So there is that disparity in wages, whereas I think cost of living is extremely high in both places and very similar across big cities like Sydney and Toronto. So I think the gap between wages and affordability is definitely greater in Canada, and therefore I think Australia is more affordable than Canada overall when you compare similar cities to each other. I also want to touch upon the infrastructure and the roads, the trains, the subway systems, the airport in both countries. I think that Australia is definitely more organized than Canada is. If we talk about, once again, the GTA region, I think the system has been spread across so many different cities, and you have to like change buses and trains all the time to get around in the eastern part of Canada at least. Whereas in Australia, the in Sydney or in Melbourne, the connectivity is super strong, and I don't think you face delays as often as you do in Canada. One of the biggest things would be the subways, which are the trains in Australia are far safer than the subway system in Toronto. In fact, things like stabbings and murders tend to happen every other week in the Toronto subway, and for whatever reason, that behavior is completely normalized here. Whereas I cannot imagine people getting away with that kind of crime in a place like Sydney or Melbourne. I think there would be an uprising, and that would not be acceptable. But for some reason, it is a lot more normalized in Canada, and so safety would be a question mark on public transport in Canada, I would say, compared to Australia. That's a big win for Australia in my eyes. If we talk about roads and connectivity, I do think they are similar in both countries, but slightly better in Australia. I think it is harder for Canada to maintain its roads because of the snow. So there is that. If I talk about the airports, easy hands down win for Australia. Even though Sydney Airport closes at like 11 p.m., which is uh, not great for a city the size of Sydney, but they are building a new airport and they are fixing their issues. But you won't come across the issues that you do on Canadian airports. Every other Air Canada flight is delayed, and Toronto Airport was literally ranked the worst in the whole world for delays last year in 2022. Uh, those aren't the kind of stats you would expect from Australia. In fact, Qantas Airlines, the Australian national carrier, was ranked the safest airline in the whole world for 2023. So you see that massive disparity, whether it's in trains, buses, road transportation, or even with flying. Australia beats Canada in every department in my eyes. Australian cities are decisively happier than Canadian ones. And this is what the data shows. I think weather also plays a role in this. Of course, you would have heard of seasonal depression, and I do think the winter blues play a role in bringing down Canada's mood a little. So I think that's another place where Australia scores, but only marginally because Canadian cities still rank pretty okay when you look at it from a global perspective. Um, the other thing I want to touch upon is the healthcare systems, which are equally bad in both countries. The biggest issue with the healthcare system in both these countries is that there is you have to wait hours and hours to before you can actually get medical treatment, before you can actually um, get medical care, whether it's to see just a doctor or to actually get treatment. Like if you need a surgery or an operation, then it you can expect to wait months and months, sometimes years, in both these countries, depending on where you live, depending on availability and whatnot. So I think this is a big problem in both these countries. I would still marginally give this one to Australia for the simple reason that at least when you have insurance in Australia, you are covered across the country because the insurance is basically federal medical insurance. Whereas in Canada, it is much more complicated, and your medical insurance will change, and the rules and the conditions of your medical insurance will also change based on the province you are in. So, if you're in Ontario versus you're in New Brunswick, or you're in Saskatchewan or British Columbia, you need to purchase new medical insurance, and it will change also based on the visa that you hold. So, there's a lot of complications with Canadian healthcare, I feel, compared to Australian healthcare, just in terms of the administration and whatnot. Speaking of administration, I also have to say that the government processes in Australia are far more efficient. Everything happens digitally, whether it's getting your visa. If you need a visa to go to either of these countries, then you would know that in Australia um, the process is completely digital. So you just apply for an Australian visa, you get approved, and you go. Whereas in Canada, you actually have to submit your passport, and they physically stamp your passport. They make a physical print, a visa print on your passport in Canada. So they require your passport, and you have to mail it to them. So that is a bit 19th century, I would say, of Canada. And I think I've noticed this even with, say, you get a SIN number in Canada, which allows you to work essentially. It's called a TFN in Australia. You get your TFN digitally in Australia, but for your social insurance number, you have to stand in a long ass queue and get that number from the government department, from Service Canada, Service Ontario, whatever. Um, you can get it digitally as well, to be fair, the SIN number, but you have to wait longer for that. So that's the trade off for that. So I think Administrative processes, government processes in Australia are definitely a lot better because everything is digital, as it should be. It's the 21st century. So that's again somewhere Canada loses out, unfortunately. I would conclude by saying that I think that Canada compares itself a lot to the United States, um, and it's pretty satisfied in that comparison because largely Canada wins against the United States, right? In most departments, Canada comes across as a safer country. It has a social security system that is obviously leaps and bounds ahead of the United States. So um, Canada is happy comparing itself to the United States, and it's busy there. It is too psychologically involved in that comparison, and I think it is so because they share borders. They're close countries, so nothing surprising there. The culture is also much more similar versus, say, an Australian culture. But in Australia, I think they act more upon their own merit and they try to improve their own systems. They hold themselves to a certain standard, which I think they don't in Canada. Don't get me wrong, I think Australian media is constantly comparing itself to the United States and Europe. I always see these kinds of comparisons, but but I still think they stick to their own standards, which is not the case in Canada. And I think that's one of the main differences in the approach of these two countries. You do see a lot of New York urban culture rubbing off on Toronto and Montreal, and therefore you see the same problems from the United States manifest in Canada, and you don't see that in Australia. So I think that that's one big factor that plays a role in how these countries are moving ahead in the future. Um, and I would say that even though almost every point in this little video I've done has gone in favor of Australia, I'm sure there's for certain people like Canada is the better country, especially if you're earning more there, if you have a house there, if you like the winter. All of these are factors, and so this entire video is just my personal opinion. Um, but my personal opinion is that Australia is a far better country. Um, that being said, I don't mean to say that Canada is a bad country. I do think that while in comparison to Australia it may not seem great, it's still a pretty good country, and it is in the top 10% countries of the world, at least you could say so. So I just think Canada needs to work on fixing some of its problems, and it could go on a pathway similar to Australia then, and become a more affordable place, a more livable place, and a place with more potential. um, but at the moment, I think Australia is a clear winner.